It is a Friday afternoon in late August 1954, and a Boston family, Back Bay, 3 children, a father who left the office early, is climbing the steps to the veranda at Chatham Bars Inn, on Shore Road above Aunt Lydia's Cove. The children have been counting exits since the Sagamore Bridge. Before anyone reaches the front desk, a porter has already said the family's name and told them their cottage is ready, the same cottage as last August, and the August before that. The inn had opened 40 years earlier, on June 9, 1914, with about 50 rooms, 9 guest cottages, a 9-hole golf course, a pool, and a tennis court, set on a bluff with a quarter-mile of private beach below it. This is a documented composite, a Boston family taking their annual multi-week August stay at a Cape Cod Grand Inn, anchored to the inn's verified layout and to period travel coverage in magazines like Holiday. And it opens a specific question. How does a hotel come to know a family before they have said a single word? It knew them because it was built to. Chatham Bars Inn opened as a semi-private hunting lodge for wealthy Boston vacationers, financed by the Boston stockbroker Charles Ashley Hardy, whose family had hunted the Cape for 3 generations before him. A man who worked at the inn for 50 years, Raymond Barker, put the social architecture in one plain sentence: people in town couldn't come to the inn. This was the American plan world, a way of running a resort in which your meals came with the room, you dined in one dining room, you often kept the same table for the length of your stay, and you measured that stay in weeks, not nights. That structure asked something of the person walking in. You had to belong to the small, self-selecting world the inn was designed to hold, and the inn's whole promise was that it would hold that world steady, year after year. So before we go further, here is the real question underneath the porter knowing your name. What did that belonging actually give the families who had it? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the American beach hotel between 1920 and 1980: the lobby, the dining room, the pool terrace, the Saturday night ballroom, the staff who knew which table was yours before you sat down, and what each of these things meant for the specific people who organized their year-around being in them. Not nostalgia for old swimming pools. The documented social reality of an institution that gave some Americans a dining room captain who knew their name and turned other Americans away at the reservation desk. What the Chatham Bars Inn dining room gave a returning family was continuity, a captain who remembered that the children now ordering for themselves had once needed a booster cushion, the one thing a standardized chain built for strangers passing through was never designed to provide. And if you stayed in these hotels, or your family did, put it in the comments. Did your family have a New England summer and you went back to every year, a dining room where they knew your table, a beach you thought of as yours? Next time, we go inside the Saturday night dinner dance, and the social director whose whole job was making sure the same families met the same families, summer after summer. Back to the lobby, it gave them continuity. A returning family's August looked the same every single year, and that sameness was the luxury. There was the veranda at sunset, a fixture of the inn since 1914, where guests gathered to watch the sky change over the water. There were the children turned loose on the private beach, and the launch that carried them across the harbor to the wild sand of North Beach. There was produce from the inn's own farm arriving on the dinner plate before anyone called it farm to table. And there was the dining room captain, who remembered that the teenagers now ordering for themselves had once needed a cushion to reach the table. Here is the insider truth of a place like this: what these families were actually buying was not the golf or the chowder. It was the guarantee that next summer would look exactly like this one, that the institution would remember them so they could stop having to explain themselves. But every arrangement built to include some people has an edge, a line where the inclusion stops. Who was standing on the far side of that line? Before you can understand who was on the far side of that line, you need to understand what a restricted resort meant in 1950s New England. Restricted clientele, genteel clientele, selected Christian clientele, these were not private feelings. They were advertising phrases, printed in brochures and on the backs of postcards, and their plain purpose was to signal that Jews would not be welcome. In 1952, the American Jewish Congress, meeting in Boston, reported that its investigators had found a large number of Vermont hotels and recreational centers engaged in discriminatory practices as well as discriminatory advertising, and it named names: Basin Harbor Lodge, Quimby's Inn, and others. It took until 1955 for Vermont's Attorney General, Robert Stafford, to declare the practice illegal, saying, "The very cornerstone of our nation is based upon the equality of men." Period. Advertising for comparable New England resort hotels documents all of this openly. One surviving postcard even advertises a boarding house in Hyannis, right here on Cape Cod, 4. Restricted clientele. Now, the careful part, Chatham Bars Inn itself is documented only as semi-private and exclusive. No racial incident there is on record, and we will not invent one. But the inn operated inside a world that ran on these lines. So where did the families that world turned away actually go? They built their own summer. On the island of Martha's Vineyard, just off the Cape, the town of Oak Bluffs became, in the words of historian Allison Rose Jefferson, one of several historic African-American summer resort communities along the Atlantic seaboard founded in the 1890s. Charles and Henrietta Shearer opened Shearer Cottage there in 1912, the first inn on the island to cater to black guests. The town beach, which white neighbors had pejoratively nicknamed the Inkwell, became instead the most famous of beaches across the U.S. to transform this odious nickname into an emblem of pride, and the polar bear's morning swim ritual began there in 1946. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote speeches on an Oak Bluffs porch in 1956. The novelist Dorothy West lived and worked in the town. And on the Cape itself, the Negro Motorist Green Book, published by Victor H. Green from 1936 to the mid-1960s, listed the places that would take black travelers, tourist homes, cottages, and motels like the Roost in Osterville. It never listed the Grand Inns, because the Grand Inns were not for them. Both the Boston family's August and the family who needed the Green Book are the subject of this film. Now, what actually held the inn's own system together, day to day? The staff held it together. The whole season ran on people, most of them arriving in June and gone after Labor Day. There were the boatmen who ran the launch across the harbor to the outer beach. There was the dining room captain who seated you and the waiters who worked his floor. There was the children's crew, the gardeners keeping the grounds, the farmhands on the inn's own farm, and the kitchen that turned that farm's produce and the day's catch off the Chatham boats into dinner, and, down on the sand, into a clambake. And here is what that labor actually produced. The returning families and the returning staff built up a shared body of knowledge, who liked which table, which child could be trusted on the dock, which grandmother needed the chair out of the wind. That knowledge could not be bought on a first visit at any price, it could only be accumulated, one August at a time. The inn was, in the most literal sense, an institution made of remembered detail. So what happened to all of that remembering when the season ended? In October the inn emptied out. The veranda chairs came inside, the seasonal staff scattered back to wherever they had come from, and the great shingle-style building sat quiet over a cold harbor. This had always been a summer business, and summer businesses on the Cape had already watched one lifeline die. The Chatham Railroad, a 7.1-mile spur that opened in 1887 and once ran 4 passenger trains a day up to Boston, lost its passenger service in 1931, the first line on Cape Cod to do so, and the branch was abandoned entirely by 1937. What killed the train was the automobile. And the automobile was not finished. Between 1950 and 1959, the Mid-Cape Highway was built straight down the peninsula, and the same car that had ended the railroad was now busy remaking the American vacation itself. Out on those wide new roads, something was being built that would quietly change what a family even expected a summer to be. What was it? It was the chain. In August 1952, a Memphis builder named Kemmons Wilson, furious at being charged extra for his children at shabby roadside motels on a family trip, opened the first Holiday Inn. Franchising began in 1954, and the growth was staggering, 100 by 1959, 500 by 1964, and 1,405 by 1972. The promise was standardization, the same clean room in Topeka or Tallahassee, a pool, a restaurant, and no extra charge for children, and it was sold under the slogan, "The best surprise is no surprise." That was the exact opposite of the American Plan Inn, whose entire value was the surprise of being known. And the economics were merciless. A season-long, meals included stay for a small, self-selecting clientele simply could not compete with rooms sold by the night to anyone with a car. The American Plan season faded across New England, and Chatham Bars Inn survived only by changing, opening year-round in 1986 for the first time in its history, and completing a $100 million renovation after Richard Cohen bought it in 2006. So that is where we will leave it, on a veranda in late August, the same family in the same chairs, watching the same sun go down over Aunt Lydia's Cove. What changed was not that people stopped wanting that. What changed was the arithmetic, the interstate and the chain made it cheaper and easier to be a stranger everywhere than to be known in one place, and the season-long, meals included stay simply stopped adding up. There is no villain in that. A clean, predictable, affordable room with no extra charge for the kids, for a family that could never have afforded a month on the American plan. That is a real thing the chain gave America, and it is worth saying so plainly. But it is also worth being precise about the trade. The chain knew how to give you a room. It never knew, and was never built to know, that the young men at table 9 had grown up over 14 summers in that dining room, that the captain had watched him go from a booster cushion to ordering the striped base himself. The inn had known that for decades. The chain formula, built for strangers passing through, was never designed to know it at all. If your family had a place like that, tell us about it below, and subscribe, because next we are going back inside the dining room itself.